Donald wasn't hurt, but Sir Topham Hatt was most annoyed. I am disappointed, Donald. I didn't expect such clumsiness from you. I had decided to send Douglas back and keep you. I'm sorry, sir, said Donald. I should think so, too. You have upset my arrangements. Now James will have to help with the goods work while you have your tender mended.
The most important human in Thomas and Friends is Sir Topham Hatt, who's the controller of the Northwestern Railway, where Thomas and all of his friends work. He's a very stout and polite gentleman with a more serious side, and just like the engines he looks after, has a story of his own that I think more people should be aware of. And that's what we'll be talking about today as we dive into the history of Sir Topham Hatt, in both the Railway series and the television series. In the Railway series, Sir Topham Hatt, or as he's also known as the Fat Controller or the Fat Director, in direct definition is a fictional manager created by the Reverend W. Awdry. He looks after the NWR and is a father figure to his engines. He would first appear in the Railway series book The Three Railway Engines, which was published in 1945, and ever since has played a very large and important role in Thomas and Friends. During the continuity of the Railway series, there have actually been 3 Fat Controllers, being Sir Topham Hatt I, Sir Charles Topham Hatt II, and lastly and most recently, Sir Stephen Topham Hatt III, each one inheriting the Railway from the last. In the Railway series books, Sir Topham Hatt seems to take on a much more mature role, and definitely talks to and treats his engines a bit more seriously than his TV series counterpart. And it's this Sir Topham Hatt that I personally prefer as to why I use this figure for him. The television series Sir Topham Hatt can be described as a combination of the 3 controllers from the Railway series. The full name that he's been given is Sir Bertram Topham Hatt, and I assume he was given the Railway just like in the Railway series from his father. His first appearance was in 1984, and he's remained a pinnacle part of the show ever since. And it just so happens that we know a little bit more about the upbringing of this controller. In his youth, he was a Boy Scout, and prior to him becoming the controller of the NWR, owned a sentient steam lorry named Elizabeth, who notes and recalls that he was not the best driver. When he was a younger man, Edward would take him aboard an old coach on his birthday, and he also built the coffee pots sometime prior to Thomas arriving on Sodor, and later would receive his knighthood for his services to the railway industry. He would also be the controller of the Skarloey Railway until Mr. Percival was hired, and would end up marrying Lady Hatt, and is the grandfather of Stephen and Bridget Hatt. He has a twin brother, Sir Lowell Hatt, and his son to Dowager Hatt, basically completing the Hatt family line. And since I noted Elizabeth, I'll also note that Sir Topham Hatt recently purchased Winston as his new track inspection and transportation vehicle, at least for the rails. But now that we've talked so much about the history of the character, let's get into the models of Sir Topham Hatt that the show would use, starting off with his Gauge 1 figure. For the first season, Sir Topham Hatt's Gauge 1 figure was custom built from wood, being filled in with craft paint and constructed for distance shots only, and many depictions of this prop have been assembled for various scenarios to match the storylines. It's honestly easier to remember this as the small one, since after this we jump immediately into his close-up figure. The close-up model was constructed for scenes where he had to interact with the close-up models, and just like his Gauge 1 figure, the model had many variations to match the needs of the plots. Rather than wood, the close-up model was made from lead, which was eventually replaced with resin copies from the second season to The Great Discovery. They would often use the close-up figure in conjunction with Gauge 1 sets to create perspective as well, meaning this model definitely got its share of use. A Gauge 3.5 figure of Sir Topham Hatt was also constructed, and this would be used for scenes where he had to interact with the large-scale narrow-gauge engines. Just like the previous models, this one had many variations to match the needs of the plots, and would be constructed from resin. The 12th season marked the beginning of the show's transition into CGI, thus meaning the long-standing live-action models were no longer needed. Sir Topham Hatt was recreated from scratch in CGI by Nitrogen Studios in 2008, and was quote-unquote hand-sculpted in Maya, a 3D animation and modeling software. Different photographs of Sir Topham Hatt's close-up figure were used for referencing, and though I'm not a big fan of the CGI version of Sir Topham Hatt, it did provide us with this picture of him as a young man, which even if it wasn't CGI was just so cool to see. In terms of his surviving models, the smaller scale version of Sir Topham Hatt's Devil outfit, which for some reason remained unused, is owned by Thomas Tank Merch. The one that you happen to see now is the large scale version. A complete version and parts of Topham's model were shown off at the Midland Railway Center during an event, and another model was held at ARC Studios. The walking figure that you see here was sold on auction, along with several other Thomas props, and Tom's Props currently owns one of his small scale figures. And what do I own? Well, unfortunately nothing as cool as those, but to truly be a Thomas modeler, it almost feels wrong to not have the man behind it all somewhere, and hopefully you've left this video with a bit more knowledge on that man. Thomas has never been a show about people, and I've always found it such a strength to not include people prominently and still do so well, but the person it does choose to include prominently is just as intricate and interesting as the trains he controls. And if you were to ask my opinion, I'd say Thomas and Friends couldn't be Thomas and Friends without the Fat Controller. And though I may not be the biggest fan of what became, I, and hopefully you all as well, can always respect what was. And that is the legendary head of the railway, Sir Topham Hatt. I say was because he's not going to be in the reboot at all, so fuck you, Mattel!